Good morning. I think we'll go ahead and get started with today's event. Welcome to the 2022 Iowa City Book Festival, presented by the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature. My name is John Kenyon. I'm the director of the City of Literature, and I'm glad to welcome you and thank you for coming out this morning. I wanted to start by thanking some of the sponsors who have made the festival possible. The City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, this Iowa City Public Library, our host today and throughout this week of events. Prairie Lights Books, who are out in the hallway, and we'd be happy to sell you one of Victor's books when you leave today. Iowa Public Radio, the Graduate Hotel, and Think Iowa City. In between events, please be sure to visit the book fair at Merge, where you can meet with independent publishers from around the region who will be there showing all of their books. You can talk with those folks and learn about the things that they have published. And I did want to let you know that while the vast majority of book festival events are free, they do not come without costs. And so your financial support gives us the opportunity to present things like this festival and other events that we do throughout the course of the year. If you would consider donating, you can visit our City of Literature website at iowicityofliterature.org or the book festival website at iowicitybookfestival.org, or we've made it even easier for you if you're here in the room. The print program does have a QR code that will take you right to those spots. This program does tell you about everything going on in the festival, and even though we're more than a week into the festival, we still have more than half of the events yet to come. So we have a lot of things going on today, including several readings in this room, readings all day at Prairie Lights, and other events throughout the course of the next week. So hopefully you can join us for other events. In the meantime, we are here to listen to Victor Ray. Victor Ray is the F. Wendell Miller Associate Professor in the Departments of Sociology and Criminology and African American Studies at the University of Iowa, and a non-resident fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. His research applies critical race theory to classical sociological questions. His work appears in journals such as the American Sociological Review, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, and Sociological Theory. In addition to this research, Ray is also an active public scholar, publishing commentary in the Washington Post, Harvard Business Review, and the Boston Review. Today, he will discuss his new book on critical race theory. Please help me welcome Victor Ray.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. So today I'm just going to read a little bit from the preface of the book, and then I'm going to open up to Q&A because critical race theory has been in the news for the past couple of years, and I'm sure you all probably have some questions that we can discuss. I was 2 years old the first time the cops were called on my family. At a parade in downtown Pittsburgh, my Uncle Harold lifted me to his shoulder so I could see over the crowd. His behaving as loving uncles do led someone to jump to the conclusion that my dark-skinned uncle had abducted a light-skinned toddler. They told the police. Kidnappers aren't known for taking stolen children to parades or anywhere with large crowds. Nonetheless, the police questioned my uncle, letting us go when they were satisfied that we were family. Variations of this scene repeated throughout my life from infancy to the present. When I was about 10, a white woman driving past our trailer called the police on my dad for playing with me in the yard, again criminalizing family joy. When we were teenagers, white clerks followed my brother around stores where I walked unbothered. Questioning and threatening stares still occasionally greet my mixed-race family as we go about normal tasks. Even now, when my family gets together, we are sometimes asked if and how we know each other. My experiences with racism reflect aspects of America's broader racial system. Assumptions that my uncle and I weren't family is tied to our nation's peculiar racial categorization system, with its singular one-drop rule and its long history of bans on interracial marriage. Such bans would have outlawed my parents' union and were intended to prevent my birth. Assuming my black male caretakers were dangerous and deviant rather than loving and conscientious reflects the routine criminalization of black people's family lives and gendered stereotypes about black masculinity. And, as a seemingly endless series of videos of police violence against unarmed black men has shown, calling the police and falsely accusing a black man of stealing a child put lives at risk, regardless of the fact of innocence. By connecting individual experiences to broader patterns of racial inequality, stories like mine have shaped critical race theory. Critical race theory recognizes that narratives influence our understanding of the world and use stories as an empathetic bridge across racial divides. Stories can help outsiders understand and connect with the unfairness, capriciousness, and cruelty of racism. Critical race theorists recognize that narratives may not, in and of themselves, be compelling evidence. So they couple stories with meticulous research highlighting America's profound racial inequality, showing how race and racism shape people's lives. By highlighting the stories of how people of color navigate and survive American racism, critical race theory provides perspectives often conspicuously absent from mainstream books, movies, and media. One reason I wrote this book is that people are trying to erase and turn back the relatively minor inroads critical race theorists have made in getting these stories told. I was introduced to critical race theory as an undergrad at Vassar College when I transferred there from the Borough of Manhattan Community College. Contrary to the idea of colleges as radicalizing institutions, my introduction to critical race theory was more confirmation than revelation. I enrolled at BMCC right after 9/11, when, like many New Yorkers, I reevaluated my life. BMCC was just blocks away from the World Trade Center, and the college had lost students during the attack. When I started taking classes there in February 2002, the college served a broad swath of New Yorkers and students from all over the world. I quickly became involved in student government and anti-racist organizing, doing things like testifying at City Hall against tuition increases for some of New York's poorest students. After 2 years, I moved to Vassar, a small liberal arts college in upstate New York. The contrast between these two schools was intense, and it was clear to me that they were preparing people for different places in the social hierarchy. Despite the glaring resource differences between these schools, I watched administrators at both use similar tactics to avoid meeting anti-racist student demands for things that racial justice activists had been fighting for since the 1960s. My personal history primed me to understand critical race theory because I had witnessed the highly variable treatment received by my family members of different hues. Because I'm often read as white, I heard the ways white people, thinking they were alone, sometimes spoke about people of color. These interactions included the relatively subdued but nonetheless harmful racism that's commonplace in American culture, like asking if I felt safe living near black people or jokes about the supposed inferiority of black culture or language. Sometimes these comments included more blatant racism, like being told black folks in a fancy car must be drug dealers, or when a white Vassar student suggested that the cultural center for students of color should be torn down and replaced with, quote, whites-only parking. Scholars have documented differences in whites' talk about race in public and private, with considerably more animus and casual racism employed in what they call the, quote, white backstage. When I read the foundational critical race theory article, Whiteness as Property, which used passing as a launchpad to explore America's history of racial plunder, I knew I had found an intellectual home. The vast resource gap between BMCC and Vassar also left me with the sense that the superficial explanations for racial inequality I had previously been taught were at best wrong and at worst intentionally misleading. Personal ill feelings or the caricatured backward racist couldn't explain the callousness of social policies designed to target and shorten black life. I was also bothered by the racial liberalism I encountered among some Vassar students, a kind of smug paternalism that assumed white folks knew what was best for people of color. I knew that after graduation, these students and their paternalism were going to run things in business, the media, and politics. I felt as though, although I could but didn't pass for white, I was still the blackest person some of these students had sustained interactions with. Critical race theory also appealed to me because it critiqued inadequate explanations of racial inequality across the political spectrum. Critical race theorists skewed the right's overt hostility to people of color, evident in the explicitly anti-immigrant and anti-black policy prescriptions. But critical race theorists also criticized liberals' tepid acceptance of diversity on unequal terms, such as organizational policies that avoid confronting racialized power and resource differences in the workplace. Analytical tools developed by critical race theorists showed how colorblind racism, where the warring political camps met and compromised, facilitated laws like the 1994 Violent Crime Control Law and Law Enforcement Act that were discriminatory in outcome if race-neutral in form. Once I learned the core concepts developed by these critiques, I had a language to describe and understand the sometimes hidden processes of discrimination, exclusion, and structural racism that shape the social world. I learned that race was a social construction that helped to explain the peculiar history shaping my racial identity. Spoiler, that history shapes your racial identity too. The concept of structural racism allowed me to see how race is used to divvy up resources from classrooms to boardrooms, sometimes intentionally, but sometimes as a byproduct of non-racial actions. In other words, ideas from critical race theory did exactly what good ideas are supposed to do, allowing me to better see, understand, and navigate the world. This book spreads these good ideas, making key concepts from critical race theory accessible to a broad audience. Social theorists often convey ideas in complex technical language. For those new to the conversation, such language can obscure as much as it illuminates. In 2020, political opponents of critical race theory used its relative obscurity and specialized language to misinterpret the goals of the idea. Somewhat improbably, these opponents have made the niche intellectual tradition I work in, work that is usually confined to academic journals and lecture halls, part of a moral panic over anti-racism in the United States. Rather than a body of serious scholarship about the causes and consequences of racial inequality, critical race theory has been caricatured by these opponents as a dangerous and scary straw man. This caricature is unintelligible to those of us familiar with the enormous body of research on the history and current reality of structural racism in the United States. So I'll stop there, and I'm just going to open it up for questions about the book, about the process, about the current politics of attacks on critical race theory in the US, or actually even sort of more broadly around the world. It's spread outside our borders, so I'll open it up. Oh, and please use the mic. So.
Yeah, if you have a question, please make sure I come to you with a microphone because we are streaming this and we want the folks at home to be able to hear your question. So do we have any questions to start? Yeah, come over here. I appreciate that.
Okay, I missed the beginning introduction of this. So what is your background when you said you grew up in New York?
No, I grew up in rural PA.
Okay, that I wasn't sure where you were from and your family history, and I didn't know if that was part of the introduction.
It was part of the introduction. So I talked. It's fine. I opened with a story about the police being called on my uncle. Oh, sort of. Yes. Okay, you want to know about me? Yes, I have. I grew up in rural PA with one full brother in, I guess, a small, like mostly black community for most of the time I grew up, but it was in a county that was 2% black, right? And 96 or 97% white. And so there were sort of two small black communities. Folks were related between those communities. And then, you know, sort of rural white Pennsylvania.
All right. Well, we've got a question back here.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for coming to Iowa City. Well, you're from Iowa City.
I live here.
Sorry.
Yes. Now I'm here. Yes. I meant the university.
I've heard a shorthand for critical race theory of being that the starting line isn't equal, that people of color, you know, either way you put it, they start 100 yards behind or such. Can you tell me how much does that cover, and what more needs to be added to that analogy of an unfair starting line?
So I'm a sociologist, and I think there's a bunch of different ways to get at this point of sort of an unfair starting line, right? And so racial inequality in the United States actually starts before birth, in which black women are much more likely, due to the stresses of structural racism, to lose children in childbirth, right? Black children are more likely to have low birth weight, and then that can lead to a host of problems over one's entire life course, right? So there's a way in which, like, physically, racism gets under the skin and creates an unequal starting place. The other thing that I would say, well, I mean, there's a ton of ways to get at this question. Another way to get at this question is the wealth gap between Black and white Americans, right? And so this wealth gap is traced quite directly to the unequal starting place of American slavery and the inability after slavery of Black Americans to, on average, work or get, save money, buy houses in white neighborhoods. Even if Black families are capable of buying a house, oftentimes they get loans on unequal terms. Then their house also appreciates at a slower rate because of America's history of segregation. And so that leads to something like the wealth gap, which stands at about, usually it's between 10 to 1 and 13 to 1, depending on the economy, which means if there's sort of, I mean, put bluntly, like most Black families can't economically survive a small emergency, right? Like they don't have enough money to cover an immediate sort of health scare or a car accident or the kinds of things that the average white family, it's going to be a problem. It's going to be a major inconvenience, but they're going to, it's not going to be economically disastrous. So I think, we could talk about the history of segregated schooling. Schools are now as, if not more, segregated than they were prior to the Brown v. Board ruling, often done through race-neutral means. So there's a lot of ways to get at that question. The short answer is, yes. there is an unequal starting place, and then that unequal starting place is often compounded through inequalities that people experience as they go through life, right?
We'll grab this question up here.
Those were a couple of the questions I was going to actually touch on. When you said you had, what was it, you were actually in a town of Pennsylvania that was like 96% white. Let me guess it. Let me just the interrogation of it was that you guys were that it was basically segregated and all.
Oh, the implication was that it was segregated?
Yeah,
I mean, it was
town.
segregated. Yeah.
Yeah, did you reflect on how so blacks couldn't eat in the same place as whites, or I should say people of color should.
So there were different segregation systems developed in the North and the South, and by the time I was growing up, the system of segregation that you were talking about, the sort of Jim Crow in which we would see different water fountains, or Black folks using separate doors or not being allowed into restaurants, was heavily concentrated in the South, right? The system of segregation in the North was often done through things like housing covenants or simply refusing to sell. And so what a housing covenant is there were entire neighborhoods, sometimes like cities, in which folks would, when they bought the house, the deed would include a covenant that said they could never sell to Black folks, right? And these were legal covenants. I think they were outlawed in the late 1950s, but some places still, they're still on the books. So, when we talk, one of the things I say in the book and in some of my other writings, when we think about segregation, we often think about it in terms of laws and policies, but I think it's easier, maybe better, to think about segregation as a set of social relationships that can change depending on what people are trying to accomplish. And so what I mean by that is when we think about sort of the history of segregated schools and the outlawed with Brown v. Board, right? Segregation in schools didn't necessarily go away. It changed form. So one of the ways that it changed form was through the implementation of gifted programs and tracking, right? And so you would have schools that the same building was nominally integrated, in which you had both black and white students in the school, but you're like, who's in the sort of special education classes and who's in the advanced placement classes that's going to get them a college education? And like the racial makeup of those two programs is very, very different, right? So like I'm exaggerating for effect here, but like not that much, right? Like it's not a great exaggeration. So when we think about how segregation works, it can work through the formal mechanisms of this state. It can also work through informal mechanisms or, you know, internal mechanisms of organizations. Another example here I would say is like if we
James Meredith.
James Meredith. Yes.
Mississippi.
Yes, he was. Yeah, he was from Mississippi. Yes.
Yeah, he was like the first, one of the first people accepted in colleges of like the South.
Yeah, he helped desegregate the University of Mississippi, and
And a lot of the South too.
yeah.
We need to have questions on the microphone. Okay, we've got one here.
I'm wondering your opinion on how best to teach critical race theory. There's been such a backlash, and parents have been told, don't worry, it won't be taught in schools because it's a framework that typically is taught in law schools. But yet, if the critical race theory illustrates or illuminates the underpinnings of racial injustice in our society, it seems to me that it's a worthy framework for students to be exposed to.
It is. So I have like probably too much to say about that. Okay. So critical race theory, one of the things I try and show in the book is, yes, critical race theory arose as in legal scholarship to explain sort of why the victories of the civil rights movement were slowing down or being turned back, right? So resegregating schools, resegregating businesses, those kinds of things sort of during, Nixon and Reagan era. But it drew, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's one of the founders of critical race theory, says, like, I went to law school, but I was an African American studies undergrad before I went to law school. And when we started developing critical race theory, a lot of us had that kind of background, and we're drawing on a broader literature than just what the law provided, because they were trying to critique the law, right, and the sort of race-neutral pretensions of the law. So yes, critical race theory developed in the law, but a lot of the ideas, like structural racism, was around for decades prior to that, right? The social construction of race was around for decades prior to that. And so on the one hand, like, no one is being taught sort of, Kimberly Crenshaw's legal articles on intersectionality in elementary school, right? Like, my college students read them and they're like, this is great, but like, it's kind of hard to get, right? But I think students are being taught things about the social construction of race or things about structural racism, and I think they need to be, right? And so I think the opponents of critical race theory, one of the things they've done really well is conflate sort of any idea that makes them slightly uncomfortable about race, and they call it critical race theory, and then they use that to ban it, right? How best to teach it? I mean, I think I have not shied away from it at all. So I teach a class called critical race theory. Like I am very straightforward in the kind of work I teach, but I also realize that I'm tenured at the university. I think folks need to navigate the spaces they're in, right? I think it's very difficult to, if you have the kinds of protections I have, to say, well, an elementary school teacher without those protections should take similar risks. So I think, they need to teach the real history, the real facts about the U.S.'s racial history. But I also think that folks need to eat. They need to have an income, and that's a real concern. And yeah, they need to navigate that space. I'm not sure that's the most satisfying answer, but I think it's realistic.
Okay, we've got one more question here in the room, and then I've got one from the live stream.
Actually, she asked the question I was interested in.
How to teach it, okay.
All right, then I guess we have one from the live stream. So someone watching online says, how can understanding CRT help us improve our communities?
I think that, so I'll say, I like this question because I've been doing a lot of these, and that's like the first time I've got that particular question. And I think one way is like look at are there housing covenants in your community, right? Why are the neighborhoods or the city you live in segregated in the way it is? What's the history of that, right? How did it get there? Because segregation was constructed through policy. It's not just folks like deciding that they wanted to live together, right? I think, what are the kinds of racial inequalities that you see in your workplace? And how can you help alleviate those, right? What's the sort of mission of your organization in terms of racial equality? Is it doing anything to contribute to that or not? I think there's a lot, right? There's a lot of ways in which ideas from critical race theory can help. I would also say, intersectionality is a big idea in critical race theory. And one of the things that, like, especially Kimberly Crenshaw's early work on intersectionality was looking at, like, how policies left some people out. And so the example that I use in the book here is she was looking at the women's shelter movement, and feminists who created the women's shelters movement were doing a profound service to women who were in very dangerous conditions, right? But oftentimes those early shelters had policies that were like English only. And so that meant that women who didn't speak English, who were fleeing horrible situations, could not get the protections that the shelter movement was designed to give them, right? And so it's the kind of thinking about, like, okay, we have this policy, even, we're a very well-intentioned organization trying to do good in the world, but how could our thinking of who we see as the women who need this service perhaps leave some people out, right? And so I think examining things that your organization or your companies are doing that quite unintentionally could create harms, right? And I think one of the points that Crenshaw makes is it undermined the very mission of the shelter movement, right? Because they were leaving out the women who needed it most, right? Had the least resources.
Do we have any other questions from here in the room?
I worked in the prison system for 32 and a half years, and it was hard. It was hard because I could see differences in the law and how they used it, even with, not brown, black, Native Americans.
Yeah.
Most of us who work there was a real, how do I say this nicely? There were some staff people who pretty much thought that way, like, if you're black, you're wrong, if you're white, you're right. So it was a hard situation to deal with and try to have people come around to see that the law wasn't equal, that I could see this gentleman who was black living in a low-income area getting this tremendous sentence for cocaine and things like that. But there was this young white man whose father was a pilot for one of the airlines. His uncle was a federal judge in a different state, a different region, And he did the exact same thing, but his sentence was so much less. And again, I'm sure it's public defender versus I can afford a very rich lawyer type of situation. So, and then people would see that and think, well, he's a horrible person. I said, well, he's kind of a horrible person too. So I'm trying to learn more about this. Not that I'm in the system anymore, thank you, God. But just so that when people bring up things like this, because people will always say, well, I was brought up poor too. What's this? So people who are poor, they use that poor as a reason that people of color are lower because, well, we all start out poor, but we brought ourselves up kind of situation. And I try to point out things like getting loans and where you lived and all those things. So anyway, I'm just blathering because it's always been an irritant of mine. So thank you.
Yeah.
People online will know who I am.
So to this, I would say, like, there is good evidence that the same credential, if a black person holds it or a white person holds it, is interpreted very differently, right? And so there's this study, this like classic study in sociology from Diva Pager, who was a sociologist at Harvard. And she sent black men and white men out to apply for jobs, right? And two pairs, each pair, there were two men, right? And in each pair, she had one who was just, applying for an entry-level job with his resume. The other one had a gap in their resume of 18 months for a nonviolent drug offense, right? And so she sent these folks out to apply for jobs. They each applied for, I don't remember how many jobs, maybe 350 jobs. And she found, and this is super important, she found that white men who had the nonviolent drug offense on their resume were more likely to be called back for entry-level jobs than black men who had never served time in prison. Everything else was identical on their applications, but again, white felons were more likely to be called back, right? And so this line of research is called audit studies, and there's a ton of these audit studies in sociology. And like anyone who's taken my class, I'm always like, they always find the same thing, right? It's depressing, but they always find discrimination. Even, they do these with resumes. They send out resumes, 5,000 resumes with, one says Jamal, one says Bob, and Jamal is called back 50% less than Bob, right? And so to your point, the law or sort of the rules as written can be applied very differently in practice. And I think this is a kind of intuitive thing we all know if you've ever had a job. That like the rules are oftentimes like really good suggestions, but some folks violate them with impunity and other folks do not. And that's often based on race, based on gender, based on those characteristics. So,
got a question here in the back.
So what do you say to my conservative friends who say, hey, I'm not racist, and my kids aren't racist, and you're making my kids feel like they're racist?
I'm not making them feel anything. I mean, I would say this, like, that study, that doesn't implicate, right? So if we take the audit study I just discussed, that doesn't implicate individuals who are white and apply for jobs. They don't know that this discrimination even occurred, right? But it's also like fundamentally dishonest to not recognize the empirical facts. I might not like lots of empirical facts, right? But that doesn't mean that they're not empirical facts. So I don't like, yeah, like the feelings thing doesn't, like, it doesn't matter that much to me in the sense of like my job as a researcher is to document the social world, right? That social world is often like ugly and horrible. Not always, right? But it often is. And I don't think I'm doing anyone a service by like shying away from those facts when that's what the data shows, right? Yeah, I mean, so, one of the things I write in the book, I almost read this section, but I didn't. One of the things I write in the book is like, there's some interesting research that shows when people, for instance, are heavily committed to the idea that the criminal justice system is fair, and you show them evidence that the criminal justice system is fundamentally unfair and there's like no lack of evidence to pull from, that they don't actually revise their position, they double down, right? Because it's not necessarily about the facts, it's about a sort of identity threat at that point. And I would say we saw something, and actually there's studies that show this too, we saw something very similar with COVID, right? There were folks who were like worried about COVID transmission, then they learned that it was like concentrated heavily among certain minority groups, and then they were like all of the sudden against masking and protections, right? Because they felt like they don't understand communicable that well, right? So one of the things I write in the book is like, look, I'm not writing to those folks, right? I'm not writing them off, but like my job is not to convince those folks. The goal of this book is to say like, these are sort of enduring ideas from critical race theory that have, I think, a lot of empirical support. And I think there's also a lot of good faith folks out there who were profoundly confused by the moral panic and did not understand what critical race theory was or what it was trying to do, right? Again, like, it's just like not my ministry to, to try and convince folks who I don't think are amenable to evidence in this way, right? And let me add one more thing. I think I have a chapter in the book on a parable that Derek Bell wrote called Space Traders. It's like a science fiction story. I won't go too into it, but like one of the things that I think critical race theory does, and it gets a lot of flack for among academics, is it uses personal narrative or it uses parables and other stories. And I think that this is often a way you can get through to folks who aren't amenable to the stats, right? Or who are just like, and so I think that's a strength of critical race theory that a lot of academics are like, just show me the data and I want to move on. And I think critical race theory has a sort of broader goal of convincing people that, and it does that through other means, right? Through personal narratives, through parables and those sorts of things.
Any other questions? Yeah, we got one here.
Thank you so much, Victor, for this great talk and for your book. So I teach at the University of Iowa, too. And I teach in gender, women's sexuality studies. I teach in the history department and in Latino, Latinx studies. And I teach critical race theory in my class as well, right? Like it's a foundational sort of way it's a framework to explain social construction, right? Yeah. Like how things are built over time, how history can tell us how that's happened, and how racial systems have, and gendered systems have been constructed in the United States. And as you started off your talk, right, like these frameworks are under attack, right? The state of Iowa has passed laws, in fact, right, like making it illegal to teach these in K through 12 education. And depending on how the election goes in November, it might reach us as well, right? And so I just wonder, and I know that this is going out to a live audience, but I think it's important for our community to understand, right, that our ability to do the work that we want to do at the university is being, constricted by these false moral panics, right? Mm-hmm. Because as you stated earlier, the idea that people are actually teaching the legal critical race theory in second grade is not what's happening. And even, because my kids are in public education here, and even the most basic ideas about racism and classism and sexism are completely muted, right? Students are still being asked to do very simple things with regards to understanding the social constructions of inequality in the United States. So I wonder, what do you hope that this book does for those of us who teach it, who teach these ideas? Like, how do we create solidarity amongst ourselves, amongst educators, to be able to push back?
So there's a lot there. No, it's fine. So, I think I'll start by saying one of the things, sort of like a measure of how successful this moral panic has been, is there was a survey, I don't remember which month, but there was a survey in which they asked parents, do you support teaching your kids about America's history of race and racism and slavery? And like a majority of parents, regardless of race, said yes. And then they were like, do you support teaching critical race theory? And then like that majority shrank quite a bit, and folks were not necessarily opposed, but like that certainty shrank, right? And so I think part of what these folks have done, and this is like them speaking, not me, is intentionally muddy the waters around what critical race theory is and what they're teaching. They've made it sort of scary for parents. And, lots of folks do believe that like critical race theory is saying all white people are bad, or that kind of, nonsense that it's not saying. So I think, one thing is think about like where you can actually make a difference, where your argument is going to be useful or where it's not. At the university, like I think those of us who are tenured have some protections. I think, the law in the state has a carve-out for the university and discussions around this stuff in the university classroom. So yeah, I mean, I hope, like, as far as the hopes for the book, like one of the goals was to demystify it. When I thought about the books I teach in my critical race theory classes, like they're pretty dense texts, right? And I felt that like that was actually working against us in the public debate, and I wanted something that folks could pick up and get sort of like a bite-sized idea of what structural racism is, right? What, interest convergence, which is one of the ideas I talk about in what that means. So I hope it will contribute to that sort of demystification. But I also, there's like lots of billionaire think tanks behind pushing this, right? And so like it's kind of asymmetrical in terms of the media and sort of getting the message out there. So yeah, I mean, and the other thing is like people should do what they can.
So we need to find a billionaire to fund you and your work then.
I'm not sure that's what I want.
No, do we have any other
For my
questions from
freedom.
folks here in the audience? Yeah, that could be a double-edged sword, yes. Real quickly, if I could jump in with a question, you write about this in the book, the notion of like the individual racist versus structural racism,
Mm-hmm.
and people having a hard time thinking about structural racism because they put it all on themselves or individuals that they know. Like that individual does racist things, therefore they are a racist. I don't do that, therefore I am not a racist. They only can look at it through that
Yeah.
individualized lens. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit
Sure,
about that.
I'll talk about that briefly. I think that this is, like, a lot of people get hung up on this particular idea. And I don't talk about this in the book, but I'll use myself as an example, right? So I, am like white presenting. Oftentimes folks think I'm white when I'm out, and I get considerable privilege because of that, right? And I'm very aware of like what that has meant for my life. However, I was born not in the town I grew up in. I was born in a place called Braddock, Pennsylvania. It's it's a black neighborhood, post-industrial Pittsburgh, and it is at the bottom of pretty much any indicator you want to look at in terms of like life expectancy, health, employment in the state of Pennsylvania, right? And so, I also rates of asthma. So I had like literally debilitating asthma all throughout my childhood. And I don't know if it's sort of a one-to-one. Like you can't draw a straight line from being born in Braddock and getting asthma, but there are like highly elevated rates, right? So that is structural. right? That is from the design of the city that concentrated black folks in a place that's highly polluted and makes it hard for them to get out, right? And so even though, like, I individually, right, can pass as white and get considerable privilege from that sometimes, there's still aspects of the structure that impacted my life, right? And that impacts the lives of, like, the folks still living there, right? And so, no one was mean to me, right? To create that kind of health inequality that impacted me, but it nonetheless did, right? And yeah, I think that's one way to think about the distinction between structures and individuals.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we've got one question here. Maybe this will be our final one as we wrap up our hour.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit towards this idea of colorblind racism in our societies and the distinction between non-racism and anti-racism. It's like, personally, I work with social studies teachers,
Yeah.
and they're like, well, the language is such and such. This is not racist, but there's a difference between non-racism, colorblind ideologies, and anti-racism.
All right, so yes. So that's also like 3 questions. Non-racism and colorblind. So I'll do colorblind first. So, poll taxes under Jim Crow were a colorblind law. Everyone was supposed to pay the poll tax, right? Just like voter ID laws that target people of color in the United States right now are often colorblind, right? So you can look at the kind, and the reason, one of the reasons poll taxes worked was like poor black sharecroppers couldn't afford a poll tax, so they couldn't vote, right? And so although the law was racially neutral, there were already like severe structural inequalities that law was counting on in order to entrench inequality and deny people access to the vote, right? And so something very similar is going on in every state that is trying to pass like discriminatory ID laws or, move polling places from neighborhoods with like large portions of minorities to other parts that make it hard for them to get there, right? So there's ways in which facially neutral laws can profoundly disadvantage folks because of the way that structural racism already exists. I would think, when I think about, let me back up. Another way to describe structural racism, when we think about racism, yes, individual animosity matters, but structural racism is a distributional mechanism. It's about who gets what in US society and how that has often been built into like policy and the landscape, right? So it's about resources and access. It's not about like feelings or animosity, right? With that, when I think about anti-racist acts, I think like, yes, I don't want folks to be mean to me or my family or other people, but also like folks should have equal access to resources, right? Folks should have access to clean air. Folks should have access to clean water. Folks should have equal access to the ballot, right? These are basic sort of things that are, I think, anti-racist more than sort of a diversity training that teaches you what words not to say in the workplace, right? Although, like, folks should also be able to go to work without being harassed.
All right. We might have time for one last quick question, just to take the pressure off of you. That was a great question, by the way. All right. So now we'll put the pressure on you. Bring us home.
So how about the Supreme Court and Alito, and I don't know if you saw Ketanji, what she said about racism and the 14th Amendment. But
I did.
Yeah, very great. And
I did, yep.
So what do you think about what she said?
I mean, the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment were clearly race-targeted policy, right? Like who was not allowed to vote and who was denied equal protection, right? I think in the book when I talk about colorblind racism, I tie it very, very clearly to the conservative movement following the civil rights movement that recognized, right? So there's this quote from Nixon that I think about probably too much. And, well, actually, I'll do two Nixon quotes, right? One was when he told his, I think Houdeman was his name, one of his aides, that the whole problem is really the blacks. This is the direct quote. The whole problem is really the blacks. The key is creating a system that recognizes this problem while making it appear otherwise, right? And so this, if you think about the Southern strategy, if you think about the movement to recognize sort of colorblindness in the law following this, like they were constructing this system and they weren't shy about it, right? And then the other Nixon quote I'll use is he looked at the history of, what was his name? Romney, right? So Mitt Romney's father was in the Nixon administration in George Romney, right, in housing and urban development. And he's like, I am going to enforce fair housing laws, and I'm going to do it aggressively. And Nixon's like, no, you're not. And he actually ousted him from the administration. And Nixon said, and this one I'm gonna mangle, I'm not gonna get the quote exact, but like Nixon said, like, look, I think segregation is wrong, but I also think efforts to integrate are just as bad, right? So this is a kind of reverse racism that, like, I will oust Romney and not enforce the law before I make neighborhoods integrate, right? And so, there's this sort of like colorblind thing of like, okay, we've said this can no longer happen, but we're not going to do any action that actually would make that a reality, right? So we have a neutral law in the Fair Housing Act, but we know that without enforcement, there's nothing going to do it. So my advisor, who I write about in the book, calls this abstract liberalism, in which a commitment to equality in the abstract allows you to then say, I'm not going to do anything to actually make it happen.
All right, well, that brings our hour to a close. I know we could continue to talk about this topic for a long time, but fortunately, you can hear more about what Victor has to say if you pick up his book, which is right outside in the hallway. Again, he was speaking about his new book on critical race theory. Our friends at Prairie Lights are selling for those who are in the room, and I know that Victor would be happy to sign a copy of the book for you. He will be out in the hallway as well. So thank you very much for coming. We have much more going on today. Sarah Kenzier is in this room up next at 11:30. In the meantime, please help me thank Victor Vray.
Thank you.